Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the community manager for the High CFJ's Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. And I want to welcome you to this Dow Jones webinar, in which we are looking at diversity issue. And quick background, while putting this session together, one thing that really became obvious is the fact that why we want to give ourselves pat on the back in the media landscape, but the reality that there is still a lot that still has to be done in order to actually ensure that voices that ought to be heard are heard, and no voice is silent. And even in the media ecosystem, while we try to project and demand that the right thing is done in the kinds of stories that we cover across several bits, the media ecosystem too is taking a good reflection at itself and doing the right thing. So that is why today I'm glad that we'll be doing a session on how to produce more gender equitable coverage. And I'm joined by two distinguished persons, experts in their respective fields, who will be helping us to make a better sense of this conversation. Before we came online, we've been discussing offline with Luba, who is going to start the conversation. Luba is a writer, researcher, and audience strategist. And just a few days ago, a report entitled "From Outrage to Opportunity: How to include the missing perspectives of women of all colors in news leadership and coverage was actually launched. This report is part of a series of reports that she has been doing on this issue of diversity, and is being supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Hi, Luba, how are you doing today?
I'm very good, Paul. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, so we are really glad and honored that you are joining us to share insights from this report, especially looking at how we can address this issue from the perspective of how journalists cover their stories, the kinds of stories that they cover to ensure that gender equitability is enshrined. And we are also having with us Tessy. Tessy, who heads the investigative desk at Nigeria's Punch newspaper. And Tessy is the first lady to be heading that desk. And we are impressed. She's also one of our forum members. We're always happy that we've always celebrated her. I will continue to celebrate her. Tessy, are you able to say hi?
Yes, hello.
Hi,
Nice to join you. Good afternoon, good evening from Nigeria. It's nice to join the conversation to have to put it this way. And I look forward to a very, very productive and rewarding um, conversation.
Yes, thank you
A
very
learning session also.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Tessy, for joining us
Thank you.
from the world famous notorious Lagos traffic, and we'll be back to you. So we'll start the conversation with Luba, and Luba has some slides she has prepared for us that we'd like to take through. When she's done, we'll have this conversation, and we'll have Tessy's experience, and we'll take it from there. But before Luba takes it, I want to welcome every participant on this call, wherever you are joining us from, and whatever platform you are watching this session. If you're watching on the Facebook live stream, I say thank you for joining us. If you're looking, either you are on the forum's Facebook page, or you are watching this live stream on International Journalist Network's Facebook page, you are welcome to this edition, and don't be shy to engage with us. You can always use the chat box under the video that you're watching right now to ask your questions or make your contributions. And if you are joining us on the Zoom platform, we are always glad to hear from you, so that we would like to know where you are joining us from. And okay, now I've opened the chat box. You can tell us where you are joining us from today, and let us know whatever you want to share. If you also have questions, specific questions, reserve that question for the Q&A option, and we'll get to them at the right time. So with that said, I think the floor is ready for Luba to take it, and let's go into that presentation that I'm personally looking forward to.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let me share the slides and start off. Thank you very much for introducing the report as well. As you said, it is indeed a third in a series of missing perspectives of women in news reports. This report, as well as the previous report, covers 6 countries: India, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, and US, and is very solutions orientated. What we discovered in the previous 2 reports, one was focused on understanding the representation of women in news, and the other one was focused on understanding how women were covered in the COVID pandemic story. And what we discovered is that news is largely still a man's world across the global north and south, with women being underrepresented as in news leadership, as protagonists of news, in news gathering, in news coverage, and also audiences fewer women tend to consume news. So what we did this time is delve into 2 particular challenges along the news value chain. Specifically, we wanted to understand why women are underrepresented in news leadership, and also when they are part of news leadership, why very often they actually feel excluded from decision making. This is something that we found in the previous report to be the case. And also, secondly, we wanted to understand how to unlock a barrier that's been existing for decades, specifically women's invisibility and muted voices in coverage as protagonists. So we wanted to understand what can be done to unlock progress for these 2 elements of the news value chain. What I'm going to do is start off with news coverage, because this is what you are more interested in, but I will explain why I want to also cover what's happening with news leadership and how the 2 are interconnected. But before I do that, just to reassure the audience that this is a very robust piece of work that's anchored in many methodologies, including analysis of 900 million stories, interviews with in-depth interviews with news editors and experts from around the world. 41, in fact, we did analysis of diversity reports, analysis of 1,166 news editorial roles in the across the 6 countries, and also analysis of 1,680 online news brands, and many other methodologies. So it's really robust, and I'm only going to scratch the surface today with the findings that I will share. In terms of news coverage, what we looked at, news coverage from 3 perspectives. Firstly, representation of women in coverage as contributors. Secondly, to what extent news stories are relevant and cover issues that are relevant to women. And finally, how women portrayed in the news. And these are all areas that are really important to get right if equitable journalism is to be produced. So firstly, what I must say is that unfortunately, interest in covering gender equality issues has declined pre-pandemic, despite the fact that structurally women have more disadvantages since the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, 0.56% of coverage, global coverage of news, was dedicated to gender equality issues, and now it's gone down to 0.44%. So interest among newsmakers is declining. Secondly, in the missing perspectives of women in news reports, we looked at the share of voice of women as protagonists or contributors in the news. And we re-looked at that to see whether things were improving. And what we found is that women's voices are still marginalized in all the countries, all 6 countries and globally, compared to men's. But where the situation is particularly acute compared to the global average is in India, where every woman's voice is drowned out by the voice of 6 men. And in Nigeria, the ratio is 5 to 1. Globally, the ratio is 3 to 1. So still there is a very long way to go before women's perspectives are heard in the news. With, again, the research that ACAF did uncovered that there are 7 structural issues that affect women disproportionately compared to men. This is the pay gap, health gap, power, confidence, safety, authority, and ageism gap. And what we found is that essentially coverage of these structural gaps is absent from news. 1 in 5,000 stories contains at least one of those gender gap terms, and that compares to 1 in 200 stories that cover gender equality related terms. Both are very low, but essentially there is very little discourse about structural issues that women face. During the interviews with the editors, I asked them a question. I asked them to prioritize which news coverage gaps they thought should be prioritized, essentially, in coverage. And we found that majority of them, 64% of those who were interviewed, said that the pay gap should be prioritized in coverage, and slightly less than a majority prioritized the power gap. There was very little interest in the ageism gap, and there were interesting differences in relation to the confidence and authority gap. 20% of those whom I interviewed selected the confidence gap as something that news media had to prioritize in coverage. And absolutely all of them were from the global South countries, whereas the authority gap was prioritized by the same proportion of journalists, of editors rather, but most of them were actually from the global North. And the safety gap, which we know is a very pernicious gap that affects women disproportionately to men, and particularly women journalists, was on the periphery of the thinking of news editors. I'm going to take you through a few of these gaps, not all of them, but just to show you what stories are being missed often in news or are not covered enough. Firstly, there is the pay gap is the disparity in men and women's share of income, and that remains stubbornly large, and it will take between 203 and 343 years rather, in South Africa, UK, India, and US to actually close that gap. There was no data available for India, whereas in Nigeria, the gap is stuck at the same level, so at the current rate, it would never be closed. And what underpins this gap are social norms. And this is something that I feel very passionate about, that news, the journalists must write more about, but at the moment it's on the periphery, it's not covered enough by journalists. And what I mean in this instance, news, social norms that support men disproportionately to women. In this instance, the question that was asked, the statement that was asked audiences or the public was asked to rate is, it is natural for men to earn more than women as they should be the main providers. So publics in US, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and India were asked to agree or disagree with that statement. And you can see that vast majority of the publics in India and Nigeria agree that that statement is true, and majority of those, and a majority of men in South Africa, and almost half of women as well. But we can see that there is at least a minority who agree with that statement, and these are the statements that underpin the pay gap. And unless social norms are challenged, the pay gap will remain intact. Next, I'm going to turn to the power gap. And the way we looked at power gap is by looking at what proportion of the CEOs of biggest global 500 companies are women, and what proportion of members of parliament or people in power are women. And what we found is that men have multiple times more power, both in business. In fact, they're up to 20 times more likely. They're 20 times more likely to be CEOs of the global 500 than women. And for members of parliament, this is almost 4 times higher. However, I often, when I present, I get asked the question, would quotas help? So I thought I would show you some evidence on this. And what's in last year, 26.1% of all parliamentarians globally were women, and that was only 0.6% increase from the previous year. But that increase was entirely down to countries where quotas were introduced. And when you uncouple countries which had elections where there were quotas and countries which did not, then you can see that those with the countries with quotas secured 32% of members of parliament who are women, and those without 20% of the members of parliament were women. So it really makes a difference. Next, I'm going to turn to the safety gap. So women are, we know, overwhelmingly less safe than men, and that impacts every aspect of their lives adversely. UN Women have published, and World Economic Forum, various organizations have published a lot of research on this. And we know that globally 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, and that is very likely to be underreported. And what's more pernicious is that the statistics shows that there hasn't been improvement in the last decade. And in fact, in media, women, WANIFRA research shows that women and gender non-conforming media professionals are 3.5 times more likely to experience harassment in their job than men. Again, I want to emphasize the point about how important it is to look at social norms. This, on the horizontal axis, is the index that each of these countries has received on a Women, Peace and Security Index. So essentially, it's how safe they are. The higher they are, the more on the right-hand side of the axis they are, this means the less safe they are in their country. So in India, women are least safe, followed by Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and US. On the left-hand side are social norms, and we've taken one statement here, which is whether members of the public agree that men make better political leaders than women. And we can see that the higher proportion of people who agree with that statement, i.e. the more pro-male the norms are, the more likely women are to feel unsafe and to experience harassment and assault and to be unsafe. So it's very important when we report on violence or in any aspect, first of all, to look at the data and to uncouple in order to see gender differences, and often that's not being done. And secondly, to then look at norms, what's actually happening, whether the norms in the country are supporting that the behaviors. Next, I'm turning to the health gap. This is the gap between men's and women's experiences, treatments, and outcomes in favor of men. And what I found during my interviews was really interesting. When I asked about the health gap, almost universally, editors tended to misinterpret the gap to mean issues that are relevant specifically to women, such as menstruation or childbirth or menopause. This is how they interpret it, whereas this is actually a very different thing. What it means is that in the majority of measured countries, there is a health ranking gap in favor of men. Women's health ranks lower than men. And this is the case in 4 of the countries that we looked at: UK, US, Nigeria, and Kenya. In India, it's reversed. Women's health is better, and that's really interesting to understand. And in South Africa, it's actually at the bottom, both for men and women, in terms of health ranking. And I want to take the UK as an example of how the structural gender health gap is almost absent. So there is a lot of coverage of the National Health Service in the UK because there are a lot of, it's in crisis, and that crisis has deepened over the years and after the pandemic and with current crisis of living, etc. So there is a lot of coverage. However, what is not covered is the difference in the experiences between men and women and how much harder women have it. For example, UK has the 12th largest gender gap, health gap globally. And in fact, women are twice as likely to die 30 days following a heart attack as men, because their symptoms are often misattributed. Their physical symptoms are misattributed to psychological anxiety or stress, or in fact are dismissed. There is a very strong racial bias in healthcare, which leads to worse care and poor health outcomes for ethnic minority populations, especially for women. Yet, not a single woman of color or even a person of color is a health editor in any news outlet in the UK. So there are no people who are really versed in the community, in the problems of the community, of these communities that suffer disproportionately. In the US, for example, again, when you look structurally, the gap, US's position in health ranking for women is among the lowest. It's in the top 3 lowest of the all 156 countries in the world, but we don't read much about that. And to finish off with the health gap, when you look at the decision makers who make the decisions, they're overwhelmingly more likely to be men. In fact, top position in health organizations, men are 19 times more likely to be at the top of those organizations, and also 3.4 times more likely to be in senior positions in health organizations. So next we are moving into portrayal. As I said, how women are portrayed is incredibly important. And this is a quote from the leading expert, the writer of the global media monitoring project, Sarah Macharia, who is an expert on gender and international consultant. And this is what she said: "We see a bit of upward movement in sources and subjects who are women experts, but the really structural issues which look at gender stereotypes in the news, e.g. the proportion of stories that raise issues about gender equality, sexualization of women in the stories, etc., have either been on a plateau or on a downward trend." And she's talking about decades. So what the news and what we found in our research is that no news organization systematically measures how their news outlet portrays women, whether they portray them as empowered individuals or just victim, or what proportion of them are sexualized, what proportion are portrayed as caregivers, etc. And it's really important to measure portrayal, because we can only change what we can see, and we can only see what we can measure. So I want to give you an example, which I found fascinating, from Bulgaria, which is my motherland. And I consume news prolifically in English and in Bulgarian. And what there was recently in 2020, the Gender in Media Index was launched. And what it shows is that Bulgaria is the best performing country in the world out of 123 countries in terms of representation of women as reporters and in news gathering, news coverage as protagonists of news, subjects of news. Yet, what I find when I look at how women are portrayed in Bulgarian news, they're often portrayed in solely in traditional roles, submissive or even offensive light. And I want to give you the example of the story of Lena Borislavova. She was the head of cabinet between 2021 and 22 of the Prime Minister's cabinet. And there was a rumor that was picked up by the media that she was in fact the mistress of the Prime Minister. And that was inconclusive. No evidence was presented to show that that was conclusive. However, there was a massive media attack launched on her, not so much on the Prime Minister, but attacking her. And we took 24 of the most read stories in Bulgaria about this, about Borislavova, and she eventually resigned. And what we found was quite extraordinary. First of all, 62% of the articles that were written did not quote her, so her perspective didn't feature in it. 58% included sexual reference about her. 33% used derogatory terms to describe her, and 33% referenced her appearance. Just to give you examples of the kind of either headlines or passages in leading newspapers. The first one is a headline, "Seduced and Abandoned, the Fate of Much Trash." The second one is an extract of somebody's reflection in an article. "There is a Bulgarian saying, she washes his feet and drinks the water. It refers to women who tend to men in power, and instead of being looked after, they are turned into pathetic concubines." And the third one says, "Borislavova undoubtedly possesses excellent physique, but it is out of order for her to parade it in the ministerial cabinet." So this is why we cannot just measure gender equality through representation. We have to also look at how women are portrayed, whether there is equitable portrayal and or whether there is a projection of pro-male social norms onto news coverage that diminishes women. I also want to mention the missing white woman syndrome in news. That was a term invented by, well, invented probably is the wrong word, by the American newsreader Gwen Ifill in 2004. And it refers to the coverage of women, of white women who have been kidnapped or are missing, disproportionately to the coverage of women of color. And we're now 18 years later. We did analysis of 900 million database GDELs looking at stories. So two concurrent stories. Sarah Everard is a white woman in Britain who went missing. Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry are women of color who were killed. So all three were killed. They went missing at the same time. What we saw that in the first 10 days, which are absolutely crucial apparently for the outcome of cases, Sarah Everard was mentioned 116 times more than Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry. In fact, 11,000 mentions versus 96. And in total, when you analyze all the mentions, Sarah Everard got 9 times more mentions than Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry. And that is very much part of what we found in the report, the intersectional invisibility, the invisibility of women of color in news, news leadership, and in coverage. So although Paul really highlighted the importance to focus on coverage, I really wanted to share with you what's happening to women in news leadership in the 6 countries that we're talking about in terms of their representation and inclusion in news. Why is that? I will read out an amazing quote, generous quote by Jane Barrett, who is the global editor of media news strategy in Reuters, who was reflecting on how she learned to do news. I think one of the really difficult things is that we've come up through the newsroom, very often we've been learning by osmosis. You learn by what you see around you. And so as I was growing up in the newsroom, I learned from a lot of very excellent men. And so naturally, you've taken on board their view of what's the news story, not just their view, but how to report something. So what I found in the interviews is that often women were sharing that stories that they put forward, editors, are shut down as non-stories because this culture of what constitutes a story is very male-dominated, which is why it's important to see. So who is editing the news? We looked at 4 beats, news beats, health beats, because that's gained such momentum since the pandemic, and the 3 highest profile beats, economics and business, foreign affairs and politics. You can see that in orange part of the bar, women and men are in green. And what we found is that there is gender parity in health in 5 of the countries, and Nigeria is almost at parity at 45%. But then women are significantly outnumbered as most senior editors in politics, foreign affairs, and economics. In fact, in politics, by a factor of 3 to 1. When you look at the countries specifically, you can see that there is great variation, and South Africa is almost at parity. And in India, national versus India regional editorial leads in politics, there is a massive difference. And so in Kenya and India, there are no political editors who are women, most senior ones. In Nigeria, the ratio is 5 to 1. In the UK, 4 to 1, and US and India 2 to 1. So what we uncovered for the first time in this report, we overlaid race onto gender. That hadn't been done before, and we did that for the 3 countries with multiracial population, South Africa, US, and UK. And that led to extraordinary insights and realization that whilst I had looked at women previously in the previous 2 reports, I did not for a minute realize how much harder some women have it than others. And it's therefore really important to not look at women in news as a more homogeneous group, as far as possible, look at them intersectionally. But what we saw is that women of color in multiracial society are significantly more marginalized than other women in most senior editorial roles. For example, 46% of the working population in South Africa are women of color, but only 25% are occupy most senior roles, editorial roles. In the US, the ratio is 21 to 8, and in the UK, 8% versus 1%. Here is a summary of what's actually happening that was shared by a senior news leader from the global north. There is so much inherent implicit and explicit bias against people of color in this business, it never ends. Even when we're in power, and this is a very important point with regards to South Africa, where representation is almost at parity, but even when they're in power, senior women in senior roles often feel that they're not included sufficiently in decision making. They very often actually excluded. And when I asked in my interviews what were the key barriers for women to feel included, 3 were quoted. Firstly, the fact that there are few of them, often that's an impeding factor for inclusion. Secondly, is the persistent cultural stereotypes around assigning death. And health, which you saw previously, where there is parity almost everywhere, is deemed as a soft news. That's where women usually, traditionally have been joining, as well as education desks or social affairs. And hard news are political, economic, foreign affairs desks, where in fact usually editors-in-chief are being recruited from those high-profile news. And this segregation of roles is still very much alive decades after it was first reported on. And finally, women feel that their career is slow due to the power and authority gap that there is between women and men in news. Now, women of color face disproportionate additional barriers to those that women face. And the top three that we discovered were the fact that their race is a real barrier for them to grow in the organization. Secondly, they're systematically sidelined. And thirdly, they feel that there really is lack of support for their career growth. They're not part of the boys' club, or they're not part of a women's club. They're just on the periphery. Women of color consistently discouraged from applying for leadership roles. So you're the worker bee, but you're not supported to be a leader. It's something shared by a global leader from a global north. To summarize what's happening to women of color, they face a quadruple bind. They face racial bias, which comes on top of gender bias. They're also expected to resolve the problem of their own underrepresentation and inclusion by often being thrusted in DEI initiatives, while also being the pillar of support for everyone around them, from those above and those below. So they end up burning out at really high rate, and also ultimately they're more likely to leave the organization than other groups. So I want to very briefly touch on audiences, what's happening to audiences, and to show you how we report things and news and who the editors are ends up being reflected in how much news is actually consumed. So this is analysis based on Reuters Institute data, and it looks at the gap in interest in 16 genres, news genres, between men and women. Those in yellow are the genres that women are more interested in, and in red are those that men are. And what's fascinating is that out of 16 genres, contrary to what we might expect, women are actually interested in 11 of them, but they are not the high-profile news genres. Those that are heavily edited by men are the ones that men are much more interested in consuming, specifically international news, political news, business, science, tech, and sport. And when you look at the news consumption gap between men and women, that Richard Addy, who produced the business case for diversity, and that's hopefully subject to another session, he looked at 1600 or 1800 news websites and looked at consumption gaps online for newspapers and online news, and found that globally, women are 22% less likely to consume news than men. In India, it's 25%, in Nigeria, 29%, in Nigeria, 25%. In the UK, the gap is 20%, US 19%, Kenya 18%, and South Africa 7%. So the gap is really there, and it's a great opportunity for news providers to produce more equitable coverage and to attract more female audience, such that they reduce that gap and grow their revenues. And there is a case study that we've produced to that effect. Here is the editors that I spoke with were really interested to understand what's the opportunity that women bring for news models. And here is what one of them said. The news model is broken in so many ways, and inclusion is one of the ways to survive. This is very much what we found too. So finally, if I may focus on solutions, perhaps I should, Paul, should I skip that because I've taken very long time?
Yeah, we'd like to hear about the solution. So if you can summarize.
Okay.
That.
I'll rattle through them very much so. So we have, and I encourage you to go in the report, the solutions are packaged into 12 themes, and they go along the whole news value chain. Why is that? Because unless there is no silver bullet, just by hiring more women, the problem won't be solved. There needs to be intervention at each part of the value chain. When we get to news coverage, for example, we have a whole battery of solutions around how to improve representation of all women as contributors, or how to ensure that storytelling is relevant to women, for example, by setting up gender verticals, so gender desks or race desks, or in fact, learning to look through coverage of every story through a gender lens. As I showed, it can be done for so many stories. And also measuring portrayal, as I mentioned before. Just to mention a couple of tactical solutions in fact, I'll skip that because this is about women in leadership, and I'll move on to share some tactical solutions in terms of improving coverage. So introducing inclusive storytelling, for example, by appointing newsroom inclusion champions whose role is to expand the perspectives that are covered in news stories, and thus bringing more perspectives in, launching gender desk or race desk, as I said, increasing coverage of the 7 gender structural gaps that I shared with you, and targeting women, but not at the expense of alienating men. It's finding those stories that appeal to both and covering them from different angles. And finally, there are 9 trailblazers that we've covered extensively in the report from all over the world that are already making enormous strides in producing gender equitable coverage. So I would encourage you to read those. It's New York Times, Mint, Bloomberg, African Women in Media, Cabalaria, Nation Media Group, the Fuller Project, The Guardian, and the Media. So have a look. Thank you so much. Go to the website. This is the landing page, the address. There are so many sources you can get over and above what I've just said. Thank you, and I'm sorry if I spoke for too long.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much. I'd like you to catch your breath and drink some water. And I don't know if Tessy is ready for us. Tessy, is it okay now? Hello, Tessy. Okay, while we wait for Tessy, we have quite a number of questions already that I think you can quickly start with. Hopefully, Tessy joins us very soon. So the first question is from, I think, let's take this question from Alice. I don't fully understand the term health ranking. Can you quickly explain what that means?
Yes, of course. So the health ranking is on number of health metrics. Men and women are ranked against other countries. So how well the health of men is doing and the women are doing on certain number of parameters. And where the gap is where men are ranked much higher than women on those on those metrics in terms of their health. And this is how the ranking is. And I can go away and look exactly the definition of what metrics is taken into account for those health ranking to be produced.
Okay. Now,
but it's also described in the report in detail.
Yeah, okay. I think Alice is satisfied with that. Joker would like to know who really is not a person of color, white or black or dark. They are all colors.
That's a great question. Well, it's not a question, it's a statement, but I understand the challenge. The problem that we're facing, and that's something that we agonized over, is that when we talk about women, there is enormous, we tend to default to the majority group of women who are better represented, who tend to be more better educated, or come from second or third generation professionals, and we default to their situation. And what's happening is that often, because there is no data looking at women who are non-white, essentially, how well they're doing. They tend to become invisible. Their barriers, which are much bigger than white women's in multiracial society, are not reflected. It doesn't become clear how underrepresented they are in roles, and this is why it's really important to cut the data internationally.
Yes, I think Tessy is ready for us. Tessy, so let's hear your input regarding this issue and how it personally affects you, and insights that you can share with our forum members beyond the data that Luba has been sharing with us.
Okay. Sorry. You want me to share my personal experience, not the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
When it comes to women representation, it's actually very, very, very low. Talk about in politics, in the media, both broadcast and print, online, it's actually very, 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 very low. I'll use I'll share my experience with you. Being the first female investigative journalist, will I say, to head, the first female to head the investigative desk in one of the most reputable media houses in Nigeria. It's this is a position that's really willing, also keen to, women should be given soft landing or very soft spot or soft desk, if I have to put it that way, in the media. But what I believe is, I believe in equity, I believe in equality. If a woman can do the job, that's the woman to it. But what we find is this: most women allow themselves to be boxed to a corner. They keep saying you don't see women up there, you don't see women up there. But the truth is this: if you're not deliberate and intentional about, being up there, you're not going to get up there. If you are just comfortable with just being handed crumbs, with just doing the roadside type of journalism, if I have to tag it that way. When I talk about the roadside type of journalism, like more of the desk job, or more of the very soft type of news, you don't want to unearth, you don't want to take risk, you don't want to be harmed, if I have to put it that way. And if we as women continue to shy away from this very big responsibility, the possibility of us actually occupying those top positions that a lot of people have been actually advocating for is very, 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 very slim. I have been heading Punch investigations now for practically almost 2 years now, and I'll tell you that most of the investigative reports we've done they are top notch. And sometimes people ask, how are you able to do these reports? How are you able to embark on this adventure, in quote, as a woman? But I keep telling them that in life, you just have to take risk. And if you don't take risk in the profession that you are practicing, you're not going to excel, you're not going to make it. And when we talk about risk, taking risk has to come with passion. If you're not passionate about what you're doing, you cannot take risk. And passion, it doesn't have to be this passion that just comes and dies. It has to be a passion that burns consistently. And this type of passion is such that we have to take you from you doing this report just any report. It has to be reports that has to make impact, that has to change lives, that has to set agenda. And lately, the peg of this particular webinar is actually on women and how women can be given equitable coverage. Presently, my organization has the fact that I've heading the investigative desk. They are bringing online on board a gender desk to also ensure that women are given the coverage they deserve. They are reflected, well reflected. The bottom line is this: if you as a woman, or if I as a woman don't do it, it's not the men that will do it. It's me that I just have to take it upon myself to be able to project the female gender. I should be able to take it upon myself to project female journalists. I should be able to take it upon myself to defend female gender. And so, like I was saying, the gender desk is it's gradually coming up, and so far, even without the gender desk coming up, we've done very beautiful, impactful, gender-driven stories that that at the end of the day has brought about a lot of changes. So what I'm going to say is this: we should not always look at ourselves as the weaker vessel, like men will always refer to us as. If I always say investigation is my blood, and I'm driven, you know, as in I wake, I eat, I drink, I do everything with investigation. And you know, people will ask me why do you say that? It should be a male-dominated terrain. And I'm like, what makes it a male-dominated terrain? What a woman can do, a man should be able to do. Or what a man can do, a woman should be able to do. If a man can take a risk, why can't I as a woman take a risk? We are first human before gender. So if we continue to put ourselves down, people will also keep us in that place that we have, you know, in that space that we have carved for ourselves. So the thing there is just be deliberate, don't just be intentional, be a go-getter, set out to make a difference in any area, in any field you occupy as a woman, whether in the media, whether in politics, in any area. Just stand out, try to make a difference. That is just what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Tessy. Thank you so much, Tessy, and really, really appreciate it. That was a really, really topical point that you've made. That something that you mentioned, I think I really like, is the fact that to really close the gap of including women voices in reporting, we also need female journalists to do this. And I think it's a really, really important issue that it's really, really important to encourage more journalists, females, to go into journalism. I don't know whether Luba has any data or insights regarding the ratio of male to female journalists in the regions covered, to tie this point with what Tessy said. Luba, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. I was actually focusing on trying to respond to questions, and I realized that I was responding to you, Paul, and to the panelists. But I've just sent the link to the report, and I've also sent my email, and I encourage everyone, and your questions are amazing. Please do send them along. I'm happy to take this offline. Yes, there is the second report, The Missing Perspectives of Women in News. This is where we looked at representation in newsrooms in different countries. And it's better than obviously in leadership, because what's happening is a funnel. You have a lot of graduates. There is, in fact, in schools have exceed parity, sometimes women. Then in newsrooms, there are less than half, perhaps around 40%. And then the higher up you go, the more likely men are to occupy the top job.
Yeah, thank you very much. Probably we should take one or two more questions. I think Christina would like to know which countries with a low percentage of women in news coverage have
Something.
improved. Did your
Um,
answer that question?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Which countries with a low percentage of women in news coverage have improved the most?
We in this report we did not look at trends going back decades, but what I can say at a global level that there is no improvement, that the coverage of issues that are relevant to women is marginal, 0.02% of all coverage. And also the share of voice of women remains very marginalized. So at a global level, there is no improvement. However, what I can say is that South Africa has the smallest gap in consumption between men and women, and also one of the better ratio of coverage of women in news. So the representation of women being higher in South Africa, which is very much aided by their very liberal constitution, is actually helping, it seems. So I hope this helps with the answer.
Yeah, I think that did a lot of job in providing clarity. We are running to the last minutes of the session. So I'll start with Tessy. Tessy, what is your recommendation? What is your suggestion? What are you optimistic about going forward? And what is your advice to journalists and others that are on this call? Your mic is on there. Very good.
What I want to say is this: journalists they have to change the narrative about how women are projected in media. You know, we must start with us as individuals. There should be an attitudinal change and a change of mindset. We should shift out of the sense that things should be different. So, what can I do differently? I think that is key. We should make conscious efforts also to portray women and men in non-stereotypical situations, especially by female journalists. Like I said before, if we don't project our agenda positively, others will leverage on the gap. The bulk of the job, you know, stops at the table of female journalists. They have a lot of work to do. I also would tell my colleagues to draw a plan highlighting how they want to feel. And in doing this, they should set a timeline. A particular organization that has been encouraging journalists to do this is UN Women. And what they've been doing lately is to ensure that they bring together all, you know, CEOs and MDs of media organizations to ensure that they agree to positively project women, and they gave them timeline. And I think this is actually working out positively. And I think it's one thing we also as individuals should imbibe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. So what are your last remarks? What are your suggestions and advice going forward to our participants?
So just to add what Tessy was saying, that a change at individual level is incredibly important. And to add to that, because the problem has been is so long-standing and so pernicious indeed, it's really important to tackle change on three levels: individual, which is what Tessy mentioned, at the institutional level also, tackle processes and policies, leadership, etc., and then also at societal level, looking at norms and how to challenge those. So that's what I would like to leave the participants with.
Yes, thank you very much, brilliant and resourceful participants. And on behalf of the ICFJ, the team behind this session, I want to thank you very much for being part of this Dow Jones session. And I hope all our participants have been able to take one thing or the other. You can sense that there is a lot of interest on this subject matter and in taking this conversation forward. We are going to send a link, an email that contains link to the report itself. Is open source. You can easily access it. You don't have to pay. It's not behind any paywall, so you are free to access the full thing. And we are also, when Luba shares the presentation with me, I also intend to attach it to you and send it to you so that you can also make sense of it on your own time. And yes, I want to thank you very much for participating on this session. I appreciate everybody that has joined us from different parts of the world. I could see we had participants and from Nigeria, from Uganda, from the UK, from the US, Bangladesh, and several other places that I'm very sure I could not mention. So thank you very much for joining us today. And next week, we'll be back again to talk about this topical issue. And hopefully, we'll still be hearing from Luba because Luba, is this the last report or is there another report that is still forthcoming?
Oh my gosh, I've just done this, Paul. Give me a break. No, this is socializing this one.
Okay, it's okay, man. That's okay. Thank you. Keep up the good work. And anytime the new report is out, you're always welcome to share your findings.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you also, Tessy.
So much.
Good luck.
Thank
you.
Luck
with Lagos traffic. And so if you want to be part of this forum, know more about the ICFJ's Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, do not hesitate to check out ICFJ's website on www.icfj.org. If you also want to access resources, I highly recommend IGNet's website on www.ignet.org. And I highly encourage you to be part of our Facebook forum. Many information that we share on these calls, and those that we do not share are wholly shared on our Facebook forum. Please, I encourage you to be part of our Facebook forum and be part of our community where you can quickly and easily access a lot of resources. Just go to Facebook and I think I can just help you get the link directly. And so just click from here and just join the community. Yes, thank you very much, Stella. Just click the link that Stella just put up and it's going to take you straight to the forum. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye from me.